these understanding of wildland fire combustion processes for Department of Defense managed ecosystems. And DoD fire managers use prescribed fires extensively to mimic historic low-intensity surface fires, and they require a better understanding of fine fuel heat exchange, ignition, and a number of processes involved in fire spread, and how these factors are affected by fuel condition. And so this is the overall context of how we're addressing these. These outcomes are incorporated into physics-based fire behavior models for predicting ecological effects and emission responses. These are the project scales and iterations that we work with, and I'm mostly going to address box D down at the bottom, small-scale field experiments today, but these are happening in a context of at all these other scales, of small, primarily numerical modeling to link things together at all different scales. And we've been using these models extensively as a way to synthesize these complex data sets, but also as a tool to identify what we don't know and maybe what we don't understand yet. We've been primarily using the Wildland Interface Fire Dynamic Simulator, WFDS, as well as Canopy ARPS. These are primarily Eric Mueller and Michael Kiefer that have been working on these two different simulation platforms. And so we're employing this multi-scale approach and really attempting to integrate measurements made at each scale in an iterative manner. Thus, we're trying to treat fire propagation through fuels as a coupled fuel-fire atmosphere dynamic system, and looking at key interactions at each of these scales, and that's becoming the basis, hopefully with a theoretical background, for interpreting results at all these other scales. In terms of analyzing, interpreting these data sets, borrowing tools from a number of different disciplines, all the way from physics, astrophysics, as Bob Kremens pointed out, looking at radiative heat fluxes, to flow, turbulence, and drag forces that vegetation structure exert on wind fields, as sort of the borrowed from fluid dynamics, our understanding of fluid dynamics. Turbulence and energy fluxes in forested environments from the realm of micrometeorology. Three-dimensional fuel characterization is from using LIDAR is partly derived from remote sensing techniques, again, physical properties of light. And somewhere in that mix is some forest ecology. And so within this framework, we're trying to address a number of processes. And this is just the sort of almost complete list, or not quite complete list, but a number of these. And today, I'd like to focus primarily on convective heating, convective heat transfer, as they're influenced, as the fire environment influences those, but also think about some of these other processes as we progress through this, particularly the flaming combustion, mass consumption, propagation of fires, and also as those are linked to spatial variability, not just in fuel particle type, but in fuel loading, a little bit in fuel bulk density and fuel moisture status. And then particularly think about the ambient and especially the fire effects on turbulence. And that's, I'm going to really focus right around in there. And this is some ongoing work with Warren Heilman's group that has just been really quite exciting, I think. And then lastly, look at force structure effects on turbulence during wildland fires, and maybe think about, so what are we missing at the smaller scales that we've been working at? Okay, again, we're working on fires, as Nick pointed out, Nick Stronsky pointed out in his talk, fires that we use, so relatively low intensity prescribed fires, not intense crown fires or wildfires. So really, fire that's used as a management tool is our primary focus in this project. So these are sort of my overall objectives here. One is to just briefly summarize two approaches that are sort of surround the scale that I really want to address today, and that's just briefly describe some laboratory combustion experiments, and then the large scale, and this is 15 to 150 hectare burn experiments. And the results of these two have kind of been difficult to reconcile. And I'll get into that a little bit, is that there's pluses and minuses to working at both of these scales, and sometimes it doesn't all quite come together at the two scales. Then describe our small-scale field experiments using intensively instrumented 100-meter squared plots. And I'm going to focus on convective heating and turbulence here, but we're making a lot of other measurements, and you'll see that later in the talk. But again, in thinking about designing this as we initially planned this experiment, is that how would we bridge between the two different scales above, the very nice laboratory work, and these large-scale experiments? We found we were missing things. And so thirdly, that leads to my third objective here, and that is, can we address whether processes are consistent across scales, or perhaps unique emergent properties are occurring at specific scales or maybe under specific conditions? And what are these? Can we identify these? And then, of course, thinking about this, can we simulate these, or can we provide data sets that lead to accurate simulations of fire behavior? All right, just back to the scales here. I'm going to talk primarily about D, so small-scale laboratory experiments, and the operational burns, E, and then really focus on D, which is the small-scale field experiments. There are some very nice mid-scale laboratory experiments that are coming up, and I'm just going to briefly touch on that. Okay, so my first objective here, in the laboratory experiments, this is a burn table at University of Edinburgh, is that key factors influencing fire behavior can be controlled in the laboratory, and factors like fuel loading and arrangement, fuel moisture, ambient wind, ignition patterns, and things can really be quantified quite exactly. This is a mass loading table, so we can measure the rate of mass loss. We can measure the heat output. The image on the lower right corner shows an IR camera of this flame with a temperature scale up to about 800 degrees. So we can really control this situation, and we can develop some really nice relationships between, shown here, things like bulk density, so fuel loading as it affects the movement of air within the fuel bed, so that a denser fuel bed has a higher, or at a higher density, it's more difficult for air to move through that fuel bed, and that impacts the rate of mass loss during fires. And then along with this, the red line are the measurements, the blue lines are simulations, so we can also simulate this pretty closely. We can also look at heat release quite exactly at these different densities. And again, the measurements shown in red and the simulations shown in blue. And this led to the observation, or at least to the realization, that we were actually missing the oxidative consumption of char. And so to actually effectively simulate the heat release, we really needed to add a component of char oxidation after the initial fire front, and really after flame out occurred, so that these iterative experiments are leading to a nice sort of synthesis and a better understanding of the overall processes involved in combustion. This is a little bit more recent work that Zach has been doing, and I put this in because I want to contrast what's occurring with temperature during these burns with the small scale 10 by 10 meter experiments. And if you'll note the blue arrow at the bottom, that's indicating this sort of very rapid increase of temperature at the level of the fuel bed or in the fuel bed is indicating that there's inflow of cool air until the flame front actually hits the thermocouple itself, and then there's a very rapid increase in temperature. But that doesn't occur in thermocouples above the fuel bed, and there's also the indication of a small amount of tilt here because it's heating up after the fuel, after the main part of the consumption has occurred in the fuel bed. And so these measurements, thinking about the timing of these measurements, and as well as the shape of the increases, is giving us some ideas about turbulence and how the convective heat flow would actually move above a fire. And that's, of course, important for preconditioning of fuels and then as that fire propagates through a forest or through vegetation layers. And so processes like this we want to be very cognizant of. All right, some positives and negatives, I guess, of these experiments is certainly the positive first are that you can really control a lot of key variables involved in combustion. You can also quantify a lot of variables very nicely because you're working in a laboratory environment, and that's leading to a better understanding of the physical processes, the sort of small-scale physical processes involved in combustion. You can work with natural fuels and you can replicate. So you can actually replicate, basically look at a lot of different situations. Maybe some negatives is, yes, you're working with natural fuels, but is the orientation and arrangement different than what may occur in nature? Certainly some differences in the fuel moisture content, unless you're very careful. It's usually prone to drying things out in the laboratory, fuels out. And you're also missing the effects of vegetation structure on fire behavior because you really don't have much structure above those fuel beds. Then the key question is, how do you scale them up to field conditions? I mean, that's really the difficult part here. Some of these are addressed, and these are really neat mid-scale laboratory experiments that are being conducted at WPI and with folks, Worcester Polytechnic Institute and University of Notre Dame. And this is a wind tunnel setup and where the flow rates can be controlled, and using a much larger fuel bed, also incorporating a shrub layer, a forest floor layer. Anyway, this should be neat. And I would like to take a commercial break here and advertise first Rory's talk coming up on June 27th, and he will demystify everything about measurement of fire spread phenomena at the laboratory scale. And then 2 weeks after that, on July 11th, developing a mid-scale portable wind tunnel for laboratory and field experiments by Dr. Im and Albert Simeoni from WPI. So again, stay tuned because I think these are going to be very nice, very informative presentations. Amanda, can you still hear me?
Yes. Sorry, I was on mute. I can hear you.
Great. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. At the larger scale, we over the years have conducted a number of large-scale operational prescribed burns, and these have been tower sites in the Pinelands National Reserve, southern New Jersey. All these number of tower sites shown either in the blue or the yellow triangles there. These have all been dormant season burns in the normal burning window and under operational burning conditions. And we really need to again acknowledge the sort of endless assistance that we've had from New Jersey Forest Fire Service. They have just been phenomenal at helping us out do just crazy things out there, and they've just been great. So much appreciated. And one of the instruments that we use extensively to measure turbulence and energy in prescribed fires is called a sonic anemometer. And these sonic anemometers measure wind speed in 3 dimensions and air temperature at 10 times per second. And so we're able to work out not only heat fluxes, but also 3-dimensional winds and turbulence in the fire environment. Of course, we can't just put these right in the flame because they are sensitive instruments. But we can glean a lot of information about how the fire environment is affecting turbulence and large-scale circulation associated with fires. So how the fires are affecting turbulence. And again, thinking about not only how smoke would be emitted, but also how embers would move, how the preheating of the convective plume would lead to a drying of fuels out in front of a flame front, and how that sort of integral process occurs to precondition fuels as the fire front propagates through vegetation layers. And one of the phenomenon we've seen here is a very strong relationship between temperature and sonic temperature or thermocouple temperature, here shown in red and orange, and vertical wind speed. And so there's a very strong relationship. Warren Heilman and his group have done some very nice turbulence work here, and have determined that actually the horizontal wind speed component and it's especially the sort of turbulent kinetic energy associated with that, associated with that, the horizontal component is actually larger than the vertical component. And so there's a lot of turbulence associated with these fire fronts as they propagate through the forest. At the largest scale, we've seen this phenomenon usually only in relatively intense fires, and typically above canopy or near the top of the canopy, where after a fire front passes, we see an influx of cool air. And if you look at the upper light blue arrow, there's a down drawing of that red line right there, and that's the sonic temperature below ambient levels after a fire front passes, and that's indicative of some large-scale circulations. If you look on the lower the lower panel at the arrow, those cooler temperatures are associated with significant downdrafts, vertical wind speeds moving downwards, and so large-scale circulations like this, when do these occur? Under what conditions? And how significant is a phenomenon like this to fire behavior? And so things like this, phenomenon like this, we really need to keep in the back of our minds here as we think about accurately simulating fire behavior. We've also seen some relatively complex activities, particularly in more intense fires like this, where the upper arrow is pointing to sort of maybe a more normal sort of temperature profile of thermocouples here, where everything peaks at once, so understory, mid-canopy, and top of the canopy all spiked with temperature as crown torching occurred fairly close to that tower shown with the orange triangle. But then when the fire when the fire front came back down onto the ground, it was burning primarily as a surface fire. There was a significant amount of heating at the canopy about a minute and a half before the fire front actually got to that tower, and so that's indicative of the crowding activity out in front, but also a significant tilt in the convective heating plume that occurred. And so sort of complex phenomenon like this that is definitely occurring is sort of certainly not getting captured at these smaller scale measurements, or at least we don't think so, or maybe we're not looking hard enough. But anyway, so how do you, so the question is, how do you reconcile these types of observations with what you see in a laboratory experiment, or is it just, are they just apples and oranges? And so the design of the mid-scale is of course to try and look at some of these phenomena. All right, so positive and negative points of these field experiments are that positively, yes, you're quantifying operational prescribed fires, natural fuels and forest structure, and able to quantify or at least make some inferences about the effects of canopy structure on fire behavior. The negative points are it's too complex, really, is that with so many variables, it's difficult to attribute cause and effect to the observed fire behavior. It's also easy not to sample important phenomena, so that other than fuels and radiant heat, most of these measurements are made at points, and so somehow we need to bridge across those points to come up with a sort of a three-dimensional idea of what's going on. All we have is point measurements, and so it gets a little bit difficult to determine what exactly is happening across a three-dimensional fuel bed. All right, give me a second. I'm going to jump to, there we go. Okay. So what I would like to do next is move on to my next topic here, and that's to describe the small-scale field experiments and using these intensively instrumented 100-meter squared plots. And again, I'm going to focus on convective heating and turbulence a little bit here, because it's sort of one of the really neat things I think we're measuring at this scale. So far, we've conducted a number of these burn experiments at Silas Little Experimental Forest. And this is, the plantation is shown. You can see that sort of square in the middle. That's the plantation we've been working in so far. This has actually been a nice place to conduct work like this, because we're surrounded by meteorological towers or eddy flux towers. So there's all this is happening within the context of a lot of high-quality meteorological measurements. And that's really nice, I think, when we turn around and really try to interpret a lot of this information. A lot of these have been long-term sites, so there's long-term data sets for these. And this is, before we did anything, it's a very simple setup. It's regularly spaced trees in a plantation setup. There's very little understory fuels, but there's mostly pine needles and a very simple forest floor here. Pine needles and 1 in 10-hour woody fuels. In the growing season, there's also a sedge that's here, so it's not grass, but it's Carex pennsylvanica. And so we wanted to start with really the simplest fuel type that we could, but still have an overstory structure. Later, we'll move to more shrub-dominated systems, and so we begin to look at drag forces within the understory, turbulence and drag forces, and how those impact fire behavior. But this was actually a good place to start, I think. This is a picture of our setup, and we have 4 trusses with instrumentation. This is maybe a little better. There we go. So here, those are the 4 trusses, and they're the sonic anemometers to measure heat flux and the turbulence. There's thermocouple arrays, various thermocouple arrays. There are IR or Bob's spectral sensors for determining where the fire front was and the radiant heat output from those. There's high-speed pressure sensors. So basically, just a lot of instrumentation over a 10 by 10 burn plot here. This is just another schematic shown with a fire underneath it. Again, the spectral sensors for radiant heat fluxes, sonic anemometers for measuring the turbulence and the convective heat fluxes, fine wire thermocouples for flame and air temperature, and those are at 0, 5, 10, 20, 30, 50, and 100 centimeters, and then the high-speed pressure sensors. So a lot of instrumentation close to the ground, and then above that, a FLIR infrared camera for quantifying flame temperature and radiance, Also, rate of spread of these fires, and that's running at 25 times per second. Again, the sonic anemometers, and then one sonic anemometer above at 10 meter height, and then the 16 sonic anemometers at this configuration at 2.5 meter heights, and then all the thermocouples. So a lot of instrumentation over a relatively small area. We've also added a few other things, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide sensor to look at emissions, and then we've been trying to get a load cell or a couple load cells to measure the rate of fuel consumption here, and we haven't quite had luck, but we'll work that out. And that'll be another sort of nice data set here. Spaghetti diagrams. All this is collected at 10 times per second with Campbell data loggers, and this has been quite a setup. There's a lot of wires there. This is mostly Nick and Mike and Matt Patterson have been using a number of different LiDAR systems to quantify forest and fuel bed structure. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see the truss setup here in the scan. Also, somebody right all the way to the left, there's somebody standing right there too. So very accurate scanning. And this Nick and Mike have worked this out so nicely with the terrestrial scanning laser LiDAR system that they can actually work out pre and post burn measurements can be used to quantify fuel consumption. And this is, and the figure to the left shows the differences red and green pre and post burn, and then inverting that, they could actually work out sort of how many centimeters. And so this is a maximum consumption of 4.6 centimeters in fuel bed, and then green is 0. So very accurate. And those are lined up with brute force measurements as well as fuel moisture measurements. But just some very nice instrumentation and a very nice quantification of what we think is going on out there. All right. What I want to do is show you some pictures from the IR camera above. And so what we're doing here is we're looking down at the plot. And those 4 lines, the vertical lines, are the 4 trusses with the sonic anemometers on them. This is right at ignition of one of the burns. And so these are all line ignitions. They've been ignited with a rope that's been soaked in fuel and then ignited and then dropped on the ground. So it's a very accurate line ignition that occurs. And so we've been able to look at things like burning with the wind and often obtaining this sort of very nice ellipsoidal burn patterning like this, but also burning against the wind like this. So this is a much more slowly progressing backing fire moving through the 10 by 10 meter plots. And then you can see that tower in the middle. You're looking down on the fire. Again, there's a temperature scale to the right here with maximum temperatures of around 700 degrees centigrade, a little less than 700, and then 0 or close to 0 is blue. So the color scale is relative to the flame temperature. So again, there's the flame front, and then behind that, in the upper part of the figure, all the 10-hour fuels, cones, things like that are still smoldering combustion, producing heat. We've been able to conduct a number of experiments. During the dormant season, we've been able to look at a doubling of fine fuel, so we can actually add fuels to the plots. The upper figure shows one sort of normal fuel loading, and then the double fuel loading. These worked out to they're about 400, 800 to 800 grams per meter squared of fine fuels under the relatively same conditions, burning conditions, so that we've been able to quantify things like fuel loading in its effect on fire behavior in these 10 by 10 plots. We've also now conducted just recently a series of growing season or warm season burns, and again have looked at the effects of added fuels under pretty close to the same conditions through these. And so it just becomes a really nice tool to be able to quantify, particularly the IR camera, where the flame front is and its intensity. Okay, let me move to. Amanda, you all right? Am I okay?
Yes, I'm muting again. Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. What I'd like to do is just just look at some information here, some data from these burns. This was a dormant season burn, 2 times fuel loading, and I just want to take us through some of this information and so see what it looks like. And so what I've done here is I've plotted at each of the colored locations the sonic data, so that here's time in minutes for the burn, here's sonic temperature on the x-axis, and then the different sonic locations. The upper one's blue. You can see it's just a little bit of a blip right at 1.5 minutes. But then one of the interesting things that's happening is that 10 meters away, there's already temperature, or there's already some convective heating that's showing up on the 4th sonic in the red early on in the burn. Just ignition was just a little bit after the 1 minute mark right there. And so already there's a significant amount of tilt to the convective heating here, and that's showing up in these later sonics. Then as the fire progresses, you can see the green in the second in the second panel where that spikes a little bit before 3 minutes, and then where at the yellow sonic that spikes at about 4 minutes. So we can see this progression and see how that's affecting things like the sonic, the temperatures through time. And we can also look at, what I want to do is look at the turbulence associated with it. And so what I've done here is I've just isolated that spot at the 3rd sonic. It's shown in yellow in the upper left panel. That yellow, that's the sonic I'm looking at. You can see the temperature trace through time here. In the middle panel on the right in green, you can see the perturbations to the vertical wind speed, so there's a significant increase in vertical wind speed, and the increase shown in blue on the bottom panel of the horizontal wind speed. So the fire is having a significant effect on the turbulence signal. And then what we did is we plotted sonic temperature versus vertical wind speed to start to try to understand, so what are the relationships between these these 2 variables, and so that with increased temperature, there's also increase in the vertical wind speed, and so the sort of accelerated movement of those buoyant heated air masses. And I separated these sort of at the 2 different temperatures of the flame, and I'm going to do that through a couple of these just to sort of begin to think about, so how is the fire environment affecting turbulence even in a relatively simple fuel bed setup like this? As the fire front progressed and got a little bit more organized, that's shown in the red dot in the left panel. You can see how the increased heating here has just ramped up. Again, there's the tilted plume, and so that's showing up as the increase. In the middle panel shown in green is the increase in vertical wind speed, and then a very large increase in the horizontal wind speed associated with that. So a lot of turbulence within that in the fire environment. And again, the relationship between vertical wind speed and sonic air temperature, significant relationship between those. Okay, for a growing season burn, we had a very similar kind of setup here. And again, what I did is I just took the trace of the sonic at the third position here, and you can see this very sort of rapid in the at sonic 3, the rapid increase in air temperature here as the flame front approached and then was right underneath the sonic anemometer. A large spike in the vertical wind speed, and then also a large spike in the horizontal wind speed, and that same relationship. Again, a pretty similar slope across these. So these are some fairly consistent measurements, it looks like. The thermocouples, and there's just so much nice thermocouple data here, show some pretty neat things. And they're consistent with what we've seen with the laboratory experiments, so that in the bottom panel shown there, again, a very rapid increase as the flame front approaches the thermocouples, indicative with that blue arrow of the influx of cool air coming into that flame front, and then it hits the thermocouple, and then there's a very large increase. And that's pretty consistent across the whole, the entire fire. So this is 7 different arrays of these thermocouples, all the 0 height measurements, so all the way across the fire, starting at the blue when it was first ignited all the way to the red. So again, about 5 minutes that it takes the flame front to progress across the 10 by 10 meter plot. And then in the upper panel showing the what's happening with the sonic, or with the thermocouple temperatures a little bit higher. And again, showing this tilt to the convective heating, so that the red thermocouples are starting to heat up quite early, even though they're 7 or 8 meters away from where the fire is initially ignited, and also lower temperatures. So I think that's encouraging. That we're sort of seeing some similarities between the laboratory experiments and these 10 by 10 measurements. We conducted one other set of experiments, and we looked at with sonic anemometers mounted at 2 different heights, at 1.5 and 3.5 meter heights. This is a growing season burn, and just 1 times fuel loading. Again, the picture shows the sonics at the 2 different levels. Here's the progression. We burned with the wind. The wind was blowing the other way, and that was one of the sort of great things about this setup, is that you could sort of design an experiment under whatever conditions happen to be occurring. So it gave us a lot of flexibility here. And the sort of similar traces here, but now I have 2 different sonics on it. So here I'm showing this data from the sonic at the orange arrow right there. And the upper sonic is actually not particularly warm, but the lower one was quite warm, and showing the sort of the tilt again as it warms up slowly. Again, the middle panel showing the vertical wind speed, the perturbations there. And the lower sonic actually had increased vertical wind speed well before the upper sonic. And that's also shown with the horizontal wind speed with the same thing, is it much higher increases in horizontal wind speed close to the fire front than 2 meters higher above it, so 1.5, 3.5 meters above the flame. And then we saw this relationship again, and so where the relationship is actually different at the different heights. And so this again, I think, becomes sort of an important phenomenon to think about, is that, well, okay, there is a strong relationship between sonic air temperature, vertical wind speed, but that's height dependent. And so things like this, we want to incorporate phenomenon like this in these fire behavior models. Again, as the fire front progressed, warmer air temperatures here, so quite large perturbations. At this time, earlier to the upper sonic than to the lower sonic. And so there's already some pretty complex behavior going on here. Again, upper sonic and lower sonic shown at the bottom in blue for the horizontal wind speed. So some I guess some significant behaviors going on that that we would want to disentangle if at all possible. And again, showing those differences in the slopes, the relationships between those, showing that it's height dependent here. Okay. Now, as a way to conclude here, I want to think about and address whether some of these processes are consistent across scales, or are there these unique properties, these maybe, for lack of a better word, emergent properties that might be occurring at specific scales and under specific conditions. Certainly, there's consistency in the temperature measurements, and that's really good. And so I've just shown two different scales. Again, you set the scale on the IR camera, but it looks like, at least for both IR and for thermocouple measurements, we're definitely close in laboratory and field experiments at all the scales, and I think that's good. We also have observed the influx of cool air, and here I've shown the just one whole array right as the flame front is hitting it, the increase, particularly at the lower level, but then also at the upper levels, that there it can be influenced by convective heating from downwind. So indicative of tilt, and at least for that influx of cool air right before the fire front, that's consistent with laboratory experiments too. So there's some components of turbulence that we seem to be incorporating pretty well across these scales. This relationship, the differences in height of the sonic air temperature and associated with convective heating and the vertical wind speed, these differences with height are also consistent with some measurements that we have made previously in larger scale experiments, and that's on a 20-meter tower, where 3-meter, 10-meter, and 20-meter measurements look like the relationship also had different slopes, significantly different slopes at different heights. But how these actually all line up together, again, is going to take a little bit of work. But just that there's consistency that's occurring across phenomenon, I think is encouraging here. The one that we're missing, of course, is this influx of cool air behind the fire fronts. And this large-scale circulation looks to be occurring in sort of more intense fires, but as we also have a set of large-scale experiments associated with this project, it's going to be very interesting to see where this actually occurs. And so I think this phenomenon, we're going to be very careful to make sure that we're able to quantify this. When does it occur? When doesn't it occur? What is its importance in terms of oxygenating the flame front, and does it have an impact on fire behavior? So, sort of in conclusions here, it looks like the small-scale burn table experiments can reveal sort of key processes controlling combustion under well-controlled conditions, but they're difficult to accurately scale up to field conditions where sort of variation in multiple factors and unmeasured factors occur. These large-scale experiments that we've been working on, conducted during operational prescribed fires, provide information on processes such as interactive effects of the forest canopy, understory vegetation on turbulence and heat fluxes in the fire environment, and are also indicating that there's large-scale circulations in and around fire fronts, but they integrate so many processes that alone they're difficult to unravel as to what's going on. So the small-scale 100-meter squared instrumented fires, I think, also offer some promise in unraveling some of these factors controlling behavior, and in reconciling some of the differences, or maybe some of the phenomenon that we're observing in the large-scale field experiment, well, both in small and large-scale field experiments. it's the consistency across these that's going to be very interesting. So the number of phenomena that are consistent across scales, particularly in terms of the convective heating and turbulence, and which other ones. And so I think this is going to be a nice way to think about how to interpret this information. And then, however, so the interactions with the forest canopies at the larger scales really are complex and are going to require sort of a greater number of measurements and sort of some simulations. And again, Warren and Michael Kiefer have done some really nice work on the simulating of some of these phenomenon, but how they're actually relating to fire behavior, I think is going to be challenging but really exciting. And with that, thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Ken. That was a great presentation. Let's see. If anybody has questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. While they're doing it, I'm going to ask a very simple question. Sorry, Ken. Could you give me a layperson's definition of sonic air temperature? What makes it sonic?
I could. It's actually air temperature that you're measuring with the sonic anemometer.
Ah, okay.
And so it's very close to air temperature, but the way you measure it is it's basically like a virtual temperature, and so it's close to air temperature.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. We'll give folks a minute to type some more questions into the chat box. You covered a lot of ground in here, and I really appreciated your wrap-up points. So kind of, I'll ask another one while we're waiting folks to type questions in. Kind of coming out of your wrap-up points, I liked what you were saying about the consistency in measurements across different scales and some of the questions that that you still have. I'm wondering, for the folks that you've been working with from New Jersey Forest Fire Service or other folks, what are the most important lessons that you see for a wildland firefighter's understanding of fire?
Well, I think that to me, the way that turbulence is interacting with forest canopies, I think is really interesting, and is leading, I think, to some fire behavior that has been very difficult to model and to predict, and so there's definitely a safety element in there. It's sort of thinking about what factors are leading to transition from surface to crown fires, where crown fires are so much more difficult to suppress. And so what controls that? I mean, certainly fuels is a part of it, but the way that the turbulence and this convective heating is moving in canopies is also part of it, as are embers. And so all three of these together, I think that's sort of where we may have some impact and may really be able to help fire managers.
Great, thank you. That's a really good answer. I don't see questions in the chat box, so I'm actually thinking about opening up the phone lines. So I'm going to ask everybody out there listening to please mute your individual phone line. Oh, wait. Okay, Inga has a question, so keep your questions ready. Inga says, I'm interested in the influx of cool air. It reminded me of the Santa Rosa fire story I heard where some people's cars were in other people's backyards due to turbulence. Whoa. Do you think turbulence could be related from forest canopies to dense neighborhood, quote, canopies?
Well, it could, but also, sort of, I think the movement there was related to how the fire fronts were moving, because in that Santa Rosa fire, you had multiple fire fronts setting up some very intense turbulence. And I think we've seen that a little bit here where, the vertical and the horizontal wind speeds are really increased even in quite small fires. If you have very large, rapidly moving wildfires interacting with each other, in other words, flame fronts interacting with each other, I think that probably more of a cause maybe of sort of the movements that we saw here. And at that scale, it almost goes beyond what the forest canopy impact was, because then it's very large-scale circulation.
Got it. Thank you.
Updrafts and downdrafts. But that's a great question.
Yeah. We'll give folks maybe another 20 seconds or so to type a question into the chat box, and then I might open up the phone line and see if anybody has a question they'd like to ask out loud rather than typing. All right, I'm going to unmute the phone lines right now. All right. Anybody out there have a question you'd like to pose to Ken? Don't be shy.
Maybe we wore him out. This has been really, really fun work, by the way. And working with, to go back to that long list of co-authors, I have learned so much from my co-authors about this. It's just been fantastic. I'm just a little piece here, but it's all of us are playing a role, and to be able to put all this together, I think, and be able to improve these physics-based fire behavior models is just really, really exciting. It's challenging, but it's like I think we're actually making an impact here, at least on progressing the science with this whole project, sort of with everybody on this project. But anyway, it's a really fun team to be part of.
Awesome. I might have heard a question come in. Go ahead.
It's Inga again. I was just saying that this is just such a really cool project, and I'm so excited to see some of the results coming out of it. And it's fascinating to see the infrared results with the anemometers and everything coming together. So I really do hope you guys can find some consistent stuff across scales or scaling up and down, and that will be really, really, really interesting.
Yeah, and it may be that being able to sort of tease apart things that don't scale across scales, that is, I think that's going to be very interesting too, and why. So what can and what can't we sort of assume? I know that sort of the next set of experiments with the truss setup is going to be greater vegetation structure underneath it, and that's going to affect the movement of air quite a bit, the drag forces, and that's actually been at least in WFDS simulations, the way that you treat the drag forces of vegetation, it actually makes a huge effect on the fire behavior. And no surprises, but that ended up being sort of one of the major unknowns. And so to be able to then sort of build on top of this very simple fuel structure, and then to be able to add vegetation structure on top of that is going to be equally exciting, I think. So we have a long way to go, but it's going to be neat, I think. There's going to be a lot of interesting findings here.
Cool. Well, my clock now says 1 p.m. I think we probably better wrap up, but I am putting Dr. Clark's email address into the chat box, and if anybody has questions, you can certainly find Ken's full contact info through us at NAFB or on the U.S. Forest Service website. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us, and thank you especially to Ken, Dr. Clark, for presenting all this great information to us today. We look forward to seeing everybody virtually in another 2 weeks at our next webinar in the Startup series. So thanks again, everybody, and thank you, Ken.
All right, thank you, Amanda. Thanks, everybody.